In 1960, a letter was sent that should not exist. It was a formal reply from the United States Air Force, a response to a question about a very old map, one drawn in 1513. The letter confirmed something that quietly unravels our sense of time. Signed by Lieutenant Colonel Harold Olhmeyer, it stated that the lower part of this old map did indeed show the coast of Antarctica's Queen Maud Land. Not as we see it today, but as it looks underneath a mile of ice. The colonel's conclusion was inescapable. The coastline, he wrote, had to have been mapped before it was covered by the ice cap. How could someone, centuries before Antarctica was even discovered, chart a landscape that hasn't been seen for thousands of years? To understand how the Air Force ended up writing this impossible letter, we have to go back. To follow that puzzle back to its first appearance on paper, we step back to 1929. Istanbul. The old Topkapi Palace, once the closed heart of the Ottoman court, is being turned into a museum. Furniture is carried out, glass cases brought in. In the middle of this slow transformation, a small back room in the palace library has become a holding bay for everything no one quite knows what to do with. In that room, Director of National Museums Halil Edhem spends his days. Wooden tables sag under towers of ledgers and decrees, bundles tied with fading string leaning in tall columns. Dust rims every page. When a drawer is pulled open, a gray cloud lifts and hangs in the air for a moment. This is the last checkpoint. From these piles, a few documents will be catalogued. Most are marked for disposal and vanish from the record. The work is repetitive, almost mechanical. He lifts a bundle, checks a date, a seal, a subject. Keep slides to his left. Discard to his right, toward a sack already half full of crumpled paper. Hours pass in the dry rustle of pages and the soft thud of another stack joining the waste. In the middle of this rhythm, his fingers close around something that does not behave like paper at all. It is thicker, warmer to the touch. Instead of cracking, it gives slightly under the pressure of his thumb. Gazelle skin. At first glance, it is just a rolled strip, edges darkened by age, no official seal visible. By habit, his hand moves to place it with the other odd scraps meant for the sack. Then he feels again that supple surface against his palm and notices, along the edge, the faint bleed of colored ink. He hesitates. For a moment, the roll rests on the border between waste and what will survive. Then he draws it back, clears a space on the table, and unrolls it with both hands, careful not to strain the ancient skin. The curl resists, then yields. He weights the corners. Lines appear first. Arcs, coasts, clusters of tight, flowing script. Only after his eyes trace those lines does the larger shape resolve. It is a map, a fragment of a bigger chart. The drawing is finely worked, shores picked out in precise colors. In the margin sits a neat note in the Islamic calendar. When he turns the numerals over in his mind, the year it yields is 1513. Another inscription gives the name Piri Reis, an admiral already familiar from the archives. For the first time that afternoon, his hand stops mid-motion. Here is West Africa in a form he recognizes. Above it, the broken teeth of Europe, and across the Atlantic, the emerging outline of the Americas, placed with a confidence that does not quite match what he expects from a map drawn so early. For him, that is enough to secure its place in the new museum. He notes its accuracy, the celebrated author, the early date. His gaze then moves to the lower edge of the skin, where a broad southern landmass occupies the empty space. In 1929, this is routine. For generations, mapmakers had filled the bottoms of their charts with an imagined balancing continent, a terra australis no one had seen but almost everyone drew. He registers it as just that, a convention, not a question. In the museum's brief description, That southern coastline is not singled out. The map is catalogued for its known shores and its famous name, then moved from this workroom to a quiet cabinet. The gazelle's skin that almost slid into a sack of waste now lies flat in the dark. The detail that matters most to the future, that cold coastline at the bottom of the world, stays there, unremarked, waiting for a different kind of eye to notice what it is really showing. The year is 1956. The different kind of eye belongs to Charles Hapgood, a professor of the history of science at Keene State College. The map reaches him not in a palace vault, but in a classroom, when a student lingers after a lecture with a question about a 16th century chart that seems to show Antarctica's coast ice-free. For Hapgood, it is, at first, just an academic puzzle handed across a desk, one that quietly begins to follow him home. At home, a reproduction of the Piri Reis Map spreads across his desk. Along the margins, cramped handwriting runs in uneven lines. His first move is the one he trusts most: careful translation. He copies the words into a notebook, working through them until a pattern appears. In those notes he finds the first fracture in the official story. Piri Reis says this chart is not his own creation, but a compilation drawn from about 20 earlier maps. Some sources, the notes claim, go back to the time of Alexander the Great, centuries before mainstream history allows anyone to have charted the globe with precision. The sheet in front of him is no longer just a map. It reads like an archive, a compressed library of lost coastlines. That discovery does not resolve the weirdness. It sharpens it. Hapgood now faces the same paradox that had stopped Halil Edhem decades earlier, the scholar who had left the map as an unsolved curiosity on the archive shelf. The notes describing the southernmost landmass speak of a warm region with large snakes. Applied to Antarctica, the image is so wrong it feels like a joke. Yet the coastline will not cooperate with dismissal. Hapgood leans closer, skepticism fighting what his eyes insist on. This does not look like an artist's fantasy. Guesswork would give a vague arc, something smooth, generic. Here the line breaks and hooks and folds. Bays, peninsulas, interlocking fjords, a complexity that feels surveyed, not imagined. He traces the shore with one fingertip, following each inlet. Someone charted this. Someone was there and drew what they saw. The absurd snakes and the precise coast sit together, refusing to reconcile. His mind reaches for an exit. Perhaps a later hand added the notes, or the shoreline belongs to some other place. Each explanation falters against the intricate inlets under his finger. Accepting what the line implies would risk his reputation. Denying it would betray his method. Quietly, he lets the evidence win. Reluctantly, he writes down what he can no longer deny. This is not fantasy, but a real coastline, a cartographic echo from a world that should not exist. The thought leaves him cold. Belief is not proof. The map now feels like a ghost, evidence without context, and the puzzle shifts. It's no longer only about what the map shows, but whether he can prove how old that information is, and how knowledge like this could have survived into Piri Reis's hands. How do you demonstrate that a map carries data older than history itself? And if it does, what hidden chain kept it alive? Hapgood's answer did not lie in vanished super technology, but in something far more durable: the quiet, patient chain of human knowledge. To understand his theory, we must look at the map not as a single creation, but as an archive. Piri Reis himself made this clear. In his own notes, he states that his work was a synthesis, compiled from around 20 different source maps. These included Ptolemaic charts from the Library of Alexandria, contemporary Portuguese sailing charts, and even a map he said was sourced from Columbus. This wasn't unusual. It was standard practice. Knowledge was a current, passed from one hand to the next. A coastline charted by a Phoenician sailor could be copied in an Alexandrian library, preserved by an Arab scholar, and eventually find its way into a compilation in 16th century Constantinople. The original civilization could vanish, but the data, the lines on the page, could survive. Viewed through this lens, the Piri Reis Map transforms. It is no longer a single, impossible object. It becomes what we might call a cartographic echo, a surviving fragment of a much older, more complete picture of the world, its signal still faintly detectable centuries later. This single idea reframed Hapgood's entire quest. It was not a search for lost high technology or otherworldly visitors. It was a plausible, grounded investigation into the resilience of human memory, a search for the library that burned, the archive that flooded. It was an elegant, powerful theory. But a theory is only a story. A ghost in the archive is worthless without a body. Hapgood knew he needed proof, undeniable empirical proof. And so, he prepared for a confrontation. He would pit this fragile, hand-drawn echo from the past against the most precise, unassailable scientific data of his time. To challenge the fragile echo, Hapgood needed a modern voice, a sound wave sent through a mile of ice. He finally obtained it. It arrived as a map, the product of the 1949 Norwegian-British-Swedish Antarctic expedition across Queen Maud Land. Their teams used seismic sounding, controlled explosions on the surface, and timed echoes from the buried bedrock, the true continent hidden under the ice. What came back was not a sketch, but an acoustic photograph of a world the ice had erased. In his study late at night, with a single lamp pooling light across the desk, Hapgood began the ritual. He laid a clean sheet of tracing paper over the seismic chart and smoothed it with his fingertips, hearing the soft crackle. With the meticulous care of a monk, he followed the seismic coastline of Queen Maud Land. The pencil whispered along the curve of each bay, the hook of each inlet, the jag of each buried mountain range, features that had lain under an impossible weight of ice for thousands of years. His hand stayed mostly steady, but his mind raced. This is it. The test. It can't be more than coincidence. It has to be. A 500-year-old piece of gazelle skin, a ghost from a forgotten archive, tested against the pulse of the earth itself. He forced himself not to rush. When the tracing was complete, he lifted the paper by its edges. Beneath it lay the Piri Reis Map, the southern portion waiting, silent. He held his breath as he lowered the tracing over the 1513 coastline, nudging it until the points he trusted lined up. Then his fingers stopped. On the desk, the two shorelines slid into one another. A deep bay on the seismic tracing fell into the same hooked gulf on the old map. A long peninsula lay over the same jut of land, inked 4 centuries earlier. One line had been drawn from the echo of a sound wave in 1949, the other from an unknown source before 1513, and now they sat as a single coastline. To his eye, there was no daylight between them. He sat back in his chair, staring at the outline on the paper. In that instant he felt, with a kind of quiet horror, that he was looking at a map of Antarctica before the ice. His thoughts stumbled over the implication. If this outline was real, someone had charted that shore when it was open water, before any recorded expedition, before anyone admitted knowing there was land under the southern ice at all. The atlases he taught from wavered. Navigation, cartography. The moment humans first saw Antarctica all tilted in his mind. In the sudden quiet, the puzzle stopped feeling abstract. On the desk, on 2 fragile sheets of paper, it looked settled, almost simple. To Hapgood, this alignment felt less like a possibility than a confirmation, the closest thing to proof he could hope to hold, even as he knew How easily a skeptic could call it coincidence. For a few heartbeats, he let the exhilaration wash through him, his chest suddenly light, as if a locked door in history had swung open on his desk. Then another feeling crept in. He pictured the faces in faculty meetings, the practiced smiles, the small, polite doubts. Proving it to himself in the quiet of his study was one thing. Asking the world to accept that a 1513 map preserved a memory of Antarctica before the ice was another. This discovery might not just make his career, it could just as easily destroy it. And if he was going to risk that, he would need more than his own trembling tracing, a final, unimpeachable verdict. To prove a discovery to yourself is one thing, a private victory in the small pool of a desk lamp. Proving it to a world that has already arranged its timelines, printed its atlases, and decided what is possible is something else entirely. Hapgood knew the academic establishment would not greet this kindly. At best, they would treat him as a curiosity. At worst, as a crank. He could already imagine reviews that never touched his evidence, only his sanity. He pictured conference rooms where his name became a punchline, a publisher quietly shelving his manuscript rather than risk the ridicule. In his darker moments, it felt less like debate and more like professional execution. He needed someone outside that world, an authority on maps whose judgment carried weight for reasons that had nothing to do with university politics. If his coastline was an illusion, he wanted it exposed by people who read the planet the way navigators read the sea. He went back through everything. The 1513 Piri Reis Map, its curling edges now almost familiar as his own handwriting. The transparent overlays he had cut and aligned until the plastic was smudged with fingerprints. The seismic charts from the 1949 expedition, his Rosetta Stone, marked with neat pencil notes where the hidden bedrock coast seemed to rise through the noise. He drafted a covering letter in his small, careful script, explaining the alignment step by step, referencing each chart, each line. He numbered the pages, slid the overlays between sheets of paper so they wouldn't crease, clipped the seismic profiles to the copy of the map. When he was done, the stack on his desk was more than a bundle of documents. It was his attempt at a complete rewriting of prehistoric geography, bound together with a single address. He sent it to the one institution whose expertise in cartography he believed could not be waved away as fantasy. The U.S. Air Force. Specifically, to the 8th Reconnaissance Technical Squadron. This was not a classroom map club. It was a working heart inside Strategic Air Command. During the coldest years of the Cold War, Strategic Air Command managed America's nuclear arsenal and its global watch on potential targets. The 8th Squadron's job was to turn reconnaissance photographs into precise charts, the kind bomber crews used to find coastlines, runways, and cities on flights that crossed oceans in the dark. If anyone could say whether his Antarctic coastline matched reality, it was them. At the post office, he slid the heavy envelope across the counter and watched the clerk weigh and stamp it. With that small motion, the ultimate professional gamble left his hands. The package moved into the system. He went home to wait. Days became weeks. The silence from the Air Force had a weight of its own. At first he checked the mailbox once a day, telling himself not to be impatient. By the 3rd week he was listening for the mail truck, meeting it at the curb, sifting through bills and circulars with fingers that had started to tremble at the edges. He felt like a small boat, alone, on a wide, dark sea, its single signal lamp burning while the horizon stayed empty. In the quiet of his office, the discovery that had once felt like a clean, undeniable triumph began to shift. Some days doubt crept in, thin and persistent. Had he misread the charts? Forced the lines to fit what he wanted to see? He would unroll his copies of the map yet again, tracing the coastal curve he now knew by heart, hunting for the mistake that would let him abandon the whole idea and return to safer work. Other days, a harder certainty surfaced. The overlays still matched. The seismic profiles still lined up with the drawn shoreline under the ice. For an hour or two he would sit straighter, convinced that the pattern was real and that someone, somewhere, would have to see it too, until the sound of the empty mailbox pulled him back into uncertainty. His career now balanced on that unseen desk in some secure military office, the lectures he might never give, and the manuscript that could end up as a cautionary tale instead of a book. Alongside it sat what he believed was a buried outline of a world older than any textbook allowed, a quiet challenge to the story of human history, sealed inside this same envelope. All of it now depended on a single letter from the world's most powerful military, somewhere in transit between a guarded office and his front door. That letter arrived on July 6, 1960. Imagine Charles Hapgood holding it. The envelope would have felt crisp, official. In the corner, the letterhead of the United States Air Force, Strategic Air Command. Cold War blue, stamped with the weight of distant war rooms and sealed briefings. Around him, his office. Atlases leaning forward. A desk scarred by years of maps. The muffled summer quiet of an almost empty hallway. For a quiet professor, this was like receiving a verdict from another world. A polite but firm dismissal. A thank you for your interesting theory, but... That would quietly box his work in the margins and leave the Piri Reis Map to gather dust again. He opens the envelope. The flap tears with a small, dry sound. The letter slides out. Thick government stock. Typewritten lines in stark black. For a moment he only scans for the shape of bad news. Phrases like, regret to inform you, unable to confirm. They aren't there. His eyes track back to the start. One phrase lands, then another. Appears to be truly represented. Reasonable. His breath catches. The room narrows to the rectangle of paper in his hands. These words are not dismissive. They are measured and they are moving, sentence by sentence, toward something he has hardly dared expect. Stop there for a moment, with him in that silence. Before we read the heart of this letter, it's important to be clear about what we're listening for. This isn't a casual, yes, you might be onto something. The Air Force uses language that sounds almost like legal testimony, reasonableness, probability, and a statement about when Antarctica's coast had to be mapped, before the ice. The letter comes from the commander of the 8th Reconnaissance Technical Squadron, Lieutenant Colonel Harold Z. Olhmeyer. And this is the core of what he writes. The Princess Martha Coast of Queen Maud Land, Antarctica, appears to be truly represented. The agreement of the Piri Reis Map with the seismic profile of this area places beyond a reasonable doubt the conclusion that the original source maps must have been made before the present Antarctic ice cap covered the Queen Maud Land coasts. Beyond a reasonable doubt. On the question Hapgood had asked, whether this stretch of coastline on the Piri Reis Map matches their seismic soundings beneath the Antarctic ice, the answer from a Cold War reconnaissance officer is yes. The Princess Martha Coast, they say, appears to be truly represented, and that reading is, in Olhmeyer's words, reasonable, and the most logical, and in all probability, the correct interpretation. 1. If you accept their analysis, the simplest conclusion is that whoever drew the original source charts saw Queen Maud Land before the ice sheet buried its coasts. For Hapgood, it's not total vindication, but it is an official, military confirmation of the map's most impossible claim. Picture him reading that final clause again. Before the present Antarctic ice cap covered the Queen Maud Land coasts. The words sit there on the page, dense as ice. The ticking of a clock returns, the dry smell of paper and ink. One of the central riddles that started our journey, the coastline that shouldn't exist, now has, at least on this point, a verdict stamped with an Air Force letterhead. With that verdict, the map changes. It is no longer just an oddity at the edge of historical cartography. It becomes a fragment of an observation we cannot place in our timeline. If an ancient chart can preserve an ice-free Antarctica with enough accuracy to satisfy that Cold War squadron, then our problem is no longer only what happened back then, but what this map is doing in time at all. We've been treating it as a window into a lost past. But what if it isn't just a history? What if it's also a kind of warning, or a prophecy? What if this ancient record is trying to tell us something, not just about a world that vanished, but about our own? For decades, that question, the idea of a prophecy hidden in a map, stayed in the past. Hapgood's theory could be closed back into a book, a historical curiosity rather than a living problem. That has changed. The story is moving from the archives into the satellite feed. The ancient sources behind the Piri Reis Map spoke of a warm southern land, a coastline not buried under an armor of ice, but traced with hot snakes, bands of warmth curling along a temperate shore. Now, in the 21st century, NASA's images of the Antarctic Peninsula show something similar. Strokes of green appearing where the ice has drawn back, following the contours of rock and inlet like living lines of ink. From orbit, that overpainted canvas of sterile white begins to show its underlayer. What was flat and blinding develops texture. Dark rock exposed, meltwater channels cutting silver paths. Along their margins, and at the feet of retreating glaciers, you see the first color returning. Low mosses and green algae hugging the stone, outlining the old ice edge. This isn't just a poetic impression. It is a measured, documented change. In early 2024, a study in Nature Geoscience used decades of NASA's Landsat satellite data to put hard numbers to this change. Researchers tracked an accelerating expansion of vegetation across newly ice-free rock on the Antarctic Peninsula. In 1986, the total cover of moss and green algae was measured at 0.863 square kilometers. By 2021, that area had surged to 11.9447 square kilometers, more than a tenfold increase, directly linked to the regional warming already recorded there. In practical terms, stretches of coastline once locked in ice now offer bare ground to be colonized. Year by year, the green doesn't appear at random. It spreads like a tide, clustering along fresh rock faces, tracing ridges and bays as they emerge from the ice. The greening is in effect sketching in the true outline of the land that was hidden. When you place that evolving outline beside the Piri Reis Map, the question changes. The map's warm southern continent, edged with those hot snakes, starts to look less like fantasy and more like a memory of conditions we are beginning to see again. The ice that once erased that coastline from human view is now, through satellite data and surveys, quietly testifying that such an ice-free fringe is possible and returning. The map described a warm southern land, and now NASA satellites are watching Antarctica turn green. Are we simply witnessing climate change? Or is a lost world described by our ancestors re-emerging before our eyes? I'd be fascinated to read your thoughts on this in the comments. If a single surviving map can lie dormant for centuries and then rise to meet modern measurements this precisely, it forces a revaluation of what we think the ice has sealed away. Antarctica stops being just an empty white expanse and starts to read like a layered archive. Older coastlines, older climates, perhaps older stories, stacked beneath the present-day cap, waiting to surface. And if that is true for one continent, for one forgotten shoreline, it raises a larger question. What other timelines, what other lost chapters of our own story are being kept for us under the world's great ice sheets, held in place by the cold, and waiting for the thaw? That question from the end of our last discussion. It's the real map now, isn't it? What other lost chapters are waiting for the thaw? The Piri Reis Map is likely not an isolated anomaly. It might be the first page we have recognized from a library we never knew existed. A library of coastlines and currents that has been sealed away for centuries. And now, piece by piece, that library is beginning to return to us. The same forces that are revealing green land around Antarctica are at work all over the globe. Glaciers, ice sheets, mountain snowfields, all are retreating. As they pull back, they turn our planet's ice into an immense, unintended archaeological archive. It leaves us with a quiet fact. What we call history is only what escaped that ice. The record quietly shows this. In 2023, researchers mapped a vast ancient landscape hidden beneath the East Antarctic ice sheet. Not just a stray ridge or buried shoreline, but an entire river-carved region, over 32,000 square kilometers in extent, preserved in place for at least 14 million years. A ghost on the radar. A world that existed before the ice. And it is not only landscapes. In Norway, as ice patches retreat, they give back what they took. Over 4,500 artifacts have emerged from the thaw so far. Iron Age tools, weapons, pieces of medieval clothing, cold metal that still holds its shape, layers of fabric pressed flat by centuries of snow. The everyday texture of a life suddenly interrupted. Each item is a single, frozen moment from a forgotten timeline, now held in our hands. Together, they show how selective our memory of the past is. Our museums and textbooks are built from what survived on the surface, in temperate air and open ground. The ice has kept its own archives, hiding most of the story from us. Recorded history may be just the thin exposed edge of a far longer timeline still locked beneath the ice. If this is what melts out of a few shrinking mountain patches, what waits under the great ice sheets themselves? The Piri Reis Map showed us a forgotten coast, a single elegant line inked on a piece of animal hide. But beneath Antarctica and Greenland lie continent-sized archives of frozen water. What other chapters of our own story, what other worlds, are waiting to be revealed there? The story of this map does not have an ending. It reads like the opening chapter of a longer book. The buried landscape in East Antarctica, the artifacts sliding out of Norwegian ice, the coastline traced on the Piri Reis Map. Together, they invite us to question how complete our timeline is, and to listen to what the thaw is beginning to say. It is a gentle invitation, but not a comfortable one. Once you notice the missing pages, you cannot unsee the gaps. If this journey into what has been lost speaks to you, if you feel that same pull to look into the quietest corners of our world for the stories they keep, then I invite you to subscribe. Stay with us as we follow the melt lines and the old maps together, and keep listening to what the ice is finally willing to return.